And without wasting time, I would first introduce the first speaker, Dr. Prabhakar Dhorairaj. He's MD, DM, FACC, FESC, and he's going to tell us, are we going to learn more from broader evaluation of new glycemic lowering medication beyond cardiovascular outcome trials? And is it time to let go of cardiovascular outcome trials? Now, we've all realized, and we've all criticized maybe the FDA by saying that, after the rosiglitazone fiasco, they jumped the button and, came up with the FDA guidance. I would say it has had its pros and cons. And to talk more about that, over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Sujoy. Thank you very much for the kind words. First of all, I think I missed out one very important part in the introduction. I'm a student of Professor Ashok Kumar Das. I did my MD in JIPMER and I studied under him. So it not only stays with endocrinologists, it's come to internal medicine. He's a big professor there. I learned a lot from him, and it's very nice to listen to the emphatic voice of Professor Das today. It was really nice. Now, coming to the topic, before I get into it, I should first thank Professor Das for designing a very interesting program, not the usual conventional after we're talking about all this stuff that we keep going on. I think first of all, I should thank Dr. Das for that. And I think you made a very good introduction for the topic and said it started the rosiglitazone fiasco. But I'll go one step behind and tell you how this programs of guidance and how these approvals for these drugs came. After the UKPDS and the DCCT came, the HbA1c lowering of 0.3 to 0.4 compared to placebo was accepted as a new norm for a new anti-diabetic drug. Now this is 1998. Then subsequently things went fine till the rosiglitazone controversy, thanks to the remarkable paper in New England Journal of Medicine that came in 2007, which said there's an increased incidence of myocardial infarction. You'll be surprised to know there was actually a congressional committee meeting to discuss this, and they said rosiglitazone need not be banned. But subsequently in 2008, the FDA came up with this advisory and said that all new drugs other than insulin should have a cardiovascular safety trial. This was very, very important, and the outcome of what has been discussed over the last 1 hour by several of the speakers. They spoke so much about it, and they had discussed all the trials in detail. But what I think is more relevant is that they also said that these trials should be conducted on persons with cardiovascular disease and also in the elderly. That's interesting, because there were specific subsets of patients which are going to be high risk for cardiovascular outcomes, and they were studied. But one of the most important things that came up in the early stages was the increased incidence of heart failure that came up with the saxagliptin. And actually, Deepak Bhatt was in Chennai, and I chaired a session when I asked him, why did you select of all things heart failure hospital? Those days, people were not talking about heart failure hospitalization. He said, actually, there was some initial data which said that it might benefit heart failure and hospitalization. So we thought additional benefit we are going to check, and it actually went south. And today we notice that 2 out of the 3 patients with diabetes actually show evidence of LV dysfunction over the 5 years following diagnosis. Now, this is one of the important points that came out in the 88-21 also. And the trials have not just focused on the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease outcomes. They have been focusing on heart failure specifically. They have also spoken on stroke, and the kidney disease, something that is fantastic that has come out from the cardiovascular outcome trial. So looking at all these things, what we see, we started off saying cardiovascular safety, and what we are now looking at is an epidemic of fantastic drugs, the SGLT2 inhibitors and the GLP-1 agonists, which have shown fantastic benefits in these high risk patients with diabetes. Now, what has happened is, so far we said, whenever you have a microvascular disease, you bring down the HbA1c, the microvascular disease comes down. What about macrovascular disease was a big question, especially after 3 major trials that early on diabetes control, the VADT, Accord, and the advanced trials said early, if you look at treating very early, probably you will bring down the long-term complications of macrovascular disease, and all those things came. Now you have drugs which have shown over a period of 2 years and 3 years reduction in cardiovascular mortality, and significant across the board 30 to 40% reduction in the heart failure hospitalizations across all the patients. This is something that is fantastic that has been noticed. And heart failure hospitalization now, the best way to reduce what we have realized is possibly to treat with SGLT2 inhibitors. And it is most interesting, it is now moved out of diabetes. And I keep telling often, this is not a diabetic drug, it's a cardiac drug which has actually been started in diabetes. Because the non-cardiac patient, non-diabetic patients have also shown significant benefits, as shown in 2 majors, the DAPA-HF and the Emperor Reducer. And it's also more interesting that the emperor preserved has also been said. Preserved is the first time shown there is a drug to treat heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, which is one of the very important components of diabetes management also. There was a lot of discussion on the SGLT1, SGLT2 inhibition. The combined soloist and the other scored trials actually showed a reduction in the incidence of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction for the first time, though it's not an approved indication. Now, coming back to my topic, we'll go back and say that the cardiovascular trials have not been restricted to the atherosclerotic events. In 2000, the FDA made an alteration to its prescribed sayings in 2008 and said that you can go for the 1.3, 1.8 risk ratio, saying that if the risk ratio is more than 1, it is not going to be useful. Between 1.3 and 1.8, if you can go for a post-marketing study and still show the safety of these drugs. If the risk ratio is less than 1.3, probably the drug is beneficial if you want to introduce a new drug. So that original guidance of showing a major cardiovascular trial has slightly, the non-inferiority has been slightly reduced. But what is now interesting is the 2020 FDA guidance. Now the bar has further been lowered, or it has been altered, I should say, because they say that right now you have to look at 4,000 patient years of safety. And this is very interesting because if you look at 4,000 patient years of safety, they've also said that you must have 500 patients who are going to have 1 year of data and 500 patients with about 2 years of data. Now that is important. So if you have this much of data, you will know the safety of these drugs that keeps working. Now the 2020 guideline or the FDA guidance has clearly not gone into the aspects of safety and diabetes management pakka. What it has done is that it has totally ignored the younger patients. They said that you have to look at the elderly, the CKD, and the patients with cardiovascular disease, but they have absolutely ignored the young diabetes. Because if you look and sit down and practice clinically, I'm sure all the endocrinologists will agree that a lot of patients are in their 30s and 40s, and all the trials are in patients who are 50s with cardiovascular disease, 40s disease, or more than 65. The reason why these studies are conducted in these because the event rates are going to be much faster and much more. So you can't ignore the young diabetes and what we are dealing right, extrapolated evidence from those people. What about the vascular beds other than the coronaries? We are concerned terribly with the coronaries. What about the stroke? Yes, to some extent it's discussed, but the peripheral disease, the abdominal aortic aneurysms and other atherosclerotic diseases have totally been ignored. Ultimately, if you want me to summarize and say what is it that we need today in terms of diabetes drugs that are going to be coming in, I think the norms have changed, but you should not change the benchmark and say you need not do it. What we thought was the safety measure is showing as a revolution in the management of heart diseases. Now, to add up some more points to SGLT2 inhibitors, there are 2 recent data which has said that it is useful in ablation and antiarrhythmic drug, it has been found to be efficacious. So we're looking at more and more fantastic benefits with these new drugs, and I think we should be looking at these. Unless you do these randomized trials, these are not going to be found out. I think we should be looking at all aspects, look into a much more broader spectrum, not the cardiovascular disease, look at the entire spectrum of complex diabetes, and the newer drugs. What we should be looking at should be drugs that are going to be safer, drugs that are going to be well tolerated, and drugs that are going to be cost effective. So I think I will end by saying, yes, we need to go out of the broader spectrum, and how we go is very, very important. We have to look at a comprehensive diabetes management and look at the drugs in future. Thank you, sir. I return back to you.
I think that was an excellent overview of the topic of what has been happening in the space of cardiovascular outcome trials. And I think you quite rightly highlighted one of the aspects that, when FDA came up with its first guidance, I think even as doctors, at least I as an endocrinologist or diabetologist, did not realize how important heart failure was. We now realize heart failure events are probably even commoner than atherosclerotic cardiovascular events. So that's something which we need to probably have a greater look at when we are designing the newer trials. And you've quite rightly highlighted that, these trials do not necessarily reflect the barn door patients that you and I see in clinical practice. So we need greater representation of that, including younger people, people of different ethnicities, different backgrounds, and we've grossly neglected long-term outcomes of drugs. For example, we can all sit back and relax and say, we know enough of metformin, we have used it for 60 years. But do we really know the long-term benefits of all of these drugs? But again, we've got to balance it between 2 other things as well. Number 1, the cost of clinical trials, because that essentially pushes up the cost of the drug, and how quickly can you get the drug for the benefit of the patient. But we've realized that at least CV outcome trials, renal outcome trials, they were initially designed to show that these drugs were safe. Now we've come up to try and figure out whether they're actually beneficial. One other issue that I would like to ask you is, even in India, the DCGI or the FDA kind of tells us that if the HbA1c lowering of a drug is 0.3 to 0.4%, it is good enough to be called an anti-hyperglycemic agent. Bromocriptine got its license like that. Do you think that that is something that should be the benchmark of an anti-hyperglycemic agent, or do you think that should change, or should it have changed over the decades?
I think all diabetologists have clearly said that the amount of HbA1c lowering is depending on your initial level of HbA1c. Now, if you have an HbA1c of 9, you get about 1.5 to 1. It's a proportional lowering. That's what I gather from most of the endocrinologists and what we should be seeing. This 0.3 to 0.4, if you start looking at, I'll give you a different corollary and tell you the ARNI reduces the HbA1c, which is nowhere related to diabetes. This is heart failure drug, which reduces HbA1c by 0.3. So can it be taken as an anti-diabetic drug? I don't think so. I think that bar has to be a little more proportionately calculated. Now, you mentioned metformin. In fact, metformin was introduced in the US very, very late, and it was introduced only in 1995. 3 years after that, the FDA guidance came in. So, a lot of interesting points about what can be discussed. We can keep going on and on about this, but I think there is a very strong point to say that probably this 0.3 to 0.4 is a little too less for an anti-diabetic.
The other issue that I thought of is, we've been only looking at macrovascular disease when you talk about vascular bed with the newer drugs. But do you think there could be a differential effect on the microvasculature as well? Because you look at some of the GLP-1s, they have differential effects in terms of the renal outcome, the retinopathy outcome, and the nephropathy outcome. So should these trials, because you're enrolling patients and following them up for a significant proportion of time, should they also not be endpoints of whatever we are using as benchmarks of calling a drug good or bad?
Excellent question. This is something I was actually researching and trying to figure out. And actually, what we have been saying so far is the HbA1c correlates directly with the vascular disease that we have been. And we said that the macrovascular disease till the SGLT2 inhibitors come, and of which we are talking about multiple other mechanisms. But today, there is a combined concept to say there is an interrelationship or a bidirectional talk between microvascular and macrovascular disease. How it happens is very, very interesting. I'll just take about 1 minute to just explain what happens. When you have a macrovascular disease, what is a macro vessel? Those are the vessels which are elastic, cushion the systolic pressure. So if your cushioning effect of the macrovascular disease goes, when somebody develops a macrovascular disease, this pulsatile flow just hits in the microvascular system. There is going to be an abundance of microvascular disease. What happens, the reverse is, when there is a microvascular disease, the microvascular vessels are also present in the vasovascular of the aorta. So the microvascular disease, in effect, produces the peripheral vascular resistance increase, hypertension goes up, and that also worsens the macrovascular disease. So actually, it is no longer as a separate entity. The time taken for the macrovascular disease is much, much longer. The microvascular disease happens basically, if you look at it, in high flow vessels with very small, less than 150 micron vessels. So those are the microvascular diseases. So it's actually not a separation. It's actually not that much of a separation. So if you're looking at it, I think in future when we start talking about it, we'll be combining hypertension also to the diabetes. It's also got more or less the same possible mechanism. So if you combine these two, we will actually be talking about combination of treatment of the micro and the macrovascular diseases. The benefits have been shown there because those days we were not treating the macrovascular disease, which is not only dependent on the diabetes, but also dependent on the cholesterol to a very large extent, which we have been ignoring in today's trials. And it's out basically because once we reduce the cholesterol, we found that aspirin is good because it stabilizes the plaque. So a lot of things we are still learning, we are still evolving. And I think at this point, what we're going to see in future is a combination of macro and microvascular diseases being treated together with very effective newer drugs that seem to be working in both subsets.
And before we move on to the next session with the next speaker, is that do you not think that these pharma companies, they should be forced to contribute something to the research agencies like say NIH and MRC and made to do trials like the GREAT study? so that we actually not only have outcome data for the particular molecule that they are marketing or going to market, but they are forced to compare with the currently existing other modalities of therapy. Because, we come up with this concept about, this drug is doing well because it's an individual drug effect, or is this a class effect? We fight about that. And then because we do not have a comparator with other classes of agents, we never get to know how good or how bad it is compared to the other existing groups of drugs that we are currently using. And it makes life very difficult for the primary care physician to make a choice. Because, if you look at the GREAT study, we have always been told sulfonylureas are bad, they destroy your beta cell, and there is beta cell exhaustion. Look at GREAT study. Sitagliptin ran out of steam even before sulfonylurea. So all of this concept about beta cell preservation about sitagliptin is probably questionable. So thank you very much once again for that excellent presentation.